to the second of our new series. It's called ACS Think Tank. And this is an inclusive event. We have people in the audience tonight, we have people on the stage here in the panel, and importantly, we have people who are online. This is a hybrid event, and your thoughts, your opinions are welcome tonight. This is a space where we want to touch onto the hard stuff. We want to talk about the things that keep us awake at night. And tonight's topic is cybersecurity. Are we winning? But before we do that, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation, specifically the Wurundjeri and the Bun Wurrung tribes, upon whose lands we speak today, and we recognise the traditional custodians of those lands on which we gather across Australia, and I pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge the ACS Diversity Pledge before we start tonight, that we see the value in welcoming a diverse cross-section of people from all pathways, all identities and all individual views and thoughts. So ACS Think Tank, for those of you who don't know, is a little bit about looking at those wicked and intractable problems within the ICT industry. The idea is that we do this in an open, a town hall style, where your questions and answers are welcomed, and we want you to be a part of this, whether in person, online, viewing the event afterwards. We want to know your opinions because they're important to us and they're important to the profession. Our aim is to provide an opportunity for professional members to unpack the difficult problems, to better understand the complexities. We may not solve them all tonight, we want to understand them better, and that's really important. So with your help, we are going to give some direction to the people whose advice to listen to us. It could be ACS policy, it could be advisory policies, it could be to governments, it could be to members. So tonight, again, we're talking about cybersecurity. Are we winning? We're joined by a panel of experts, and I want to introduce them to you tonight. We have the ACS Vice President for Professional Standards Board, Joe Dalveen, in the middle. We have the Chair of the ACS Cybersecurity Committee and a cyber professional in banking and finance, transport, government, oil and gas, Mr. Loué Gashash. We've got information security risks, security and audit expert, Joe D'Alessandro at the other end. And online joining us from Perth tonight, we've got a West Australian information security professional, a seasoned expert in policing and security from both Great Britain and Australia, recently graded fellow, an ACS fellow, Mr. Tom Cleary online. Welcome, Tom. So tonight, three important things to remember. We're going to be recording this. It will be made available so you can look at this afterwards and view this on the ACS members portal. We encourage your audience participation in your debate. However, we ask that you remain respectful, so no name calling and keep things within the bounds of professional speaking. And thirdly, for those strong silent types among you, any formalised questions, comments can be submitted onto our virtual audience through the Q&A function, which will be on during the whole of this event. So please put your questions up. If you think our questions don't go deep enough, put your own questions and let's see them come to light. And finally, I guess mute is king. For those of you who are online, we may have over 100 people online tonight. Please make sure if you are going to speak, that's fine. Otherwise, keep your microphone on mute so we don't have ringing all throughout the system. So let's kick off with our first question. And that first question tonight comes from John Baird. John.
Thank you. Let's address the elephant in the room, Optus. It's been a busy week for them. I'd like to ask about the panel's thoughts on the incentives for Optus. Right now, there's a real misalignment in the economic incentives. Optus can avoid all the costs of being compliant, knowing full well that their customers will pick up the costs when it all goes wrong. Had this happened in Europe, GDPR penalties, they may very well have been hit with, I think it's about $312 million worth of fines. Here in Australia, maybe they'll get a slap on the wrist. We'll see what happens. What do you think needs to be done to try and bring some teeth to the regulation? Is that the right way? Should it be all stick or should it be carrot?
Okay, let's start with you, Loué. What's your thoughts?
Thanks. Look, I definitely agree with you. Regulators have a limited amount of power, and if you look at the size of Optus and the maximum amount of fine that they might cop today, they possibly spend more on stationery than that fine itself. So, and if you look at opposite of that, if you look at the IBM data breach record calculation they publish every year, the average cost of the breach record today is $140 per record. Multiplied by that number of records that have been breached, you get to billions of dollars of fine. Put that in front of Optus and they'll start listening. However, there's also another problem you need to unpack here is that Optus may turn around and says, but we are PCI compliance, or we are ISO 27001 compliance. They use those compliance as a checkbox exercise. That's the second part of the problem, that they don't take security seriously enough. They take it as it's a paper on the wall that we can go and use it when it pleases us. Do we really commit to that in the heart of sense? I don't think so. Yeah, and last point, sorry, before I just wrap up, I would definitely see a breach of that size should see head rolls. And that's when they will start listening and they will start taking this seriously, both at regulator size and at side and at Optus side.
So taking that further, Joe, is there further to this? Is there a professional side to this?
I'm very interested. Oh, I know switch on. Thanks, David. Thanks, Louis. I'm interested in the GPDR piece, particularly the applications that could be in Australia, which is right to be forgotten. Really, this breach is only affecting half of the numbers are current. The people who are former customers are finding that their data's been kept and retained, and not a credit card, but data that can't be changed, like your date of birth. So why was that there? And the papers and the social media are full of people who are not current customers trying to contact us now and say, can you get rid of my data? Why have you got it? So I'm hoping that this sparks a bigger conversation around data retention rights, data rights, and the consumer's right to be forgotten. I think that would be thinking that way about the individual and what right they have to say to an organisation, could you stop using my data? I don't belong, I'm not working with you anymore. What do you think?
I'd agree, and I think the economic incentives aren't properly aligned. And I like Louis' point about making the relative comparison to the value of the data lost. $140 a record, 10 million records, $1.4 billion in fines. Seems appropriate to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Heads roll, absolutely. Yeah, I have no sympathy for that. You know, and I think a point was made with a colleague earlier today that Target suffered a similar sort of public exposure, but hasn't really suffered any great consequences from it. And I think probably when we look back at what happens to Optus, it won't be. Optus will wind up being spared. Maybe some regulations or legislation will change, which would be great. I would probably also echo that I think the right to be forgotten and data retention and the enforcement of data retention or data shedding should be more at the forefront of legislators' minds.
May I add one point? Sorry. There's a problem with the data, the right to be forgotten. How do you know that Optus still hold your data? And that's something you need. Can you tell me now, every single avenue you hand over their data for the last 10 years and say, I might have signed up with my electricity with AGL for that. They have my driver license, everything else. I better call them and ask them the right to be forgotten. So even if that is in place, we still have another problem. What data those businesses keep on me? I have the right to know about that data. That's another even a preceding problem that need to be solved.
That's why it's also a legislative issue, right? If the demand is that companies don't save all the data and have to premeditatively lose data after a period of time, and that's enforced somehow, well, then it's enforced. And you don't have to remember where you or who you gave your data to. It would just be a part of their BAU for compliance. Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. We've got Natalie Anderson, who's online in Queensland. She sent through a question. She asks, cyber capability is power. Cyber skills can be used equally for good and for evil. Is there really such a thing as ethical hacking? And is there a need for greater professionalism in cybersecurity? Joe Dalveen.
Well, that's a really good one to give to me. I think in many ways some of the cyber issues in the cybersecurity discussion focuses on the cybersecurity team. And an ethical hacker is likely to be embedded in a cybersecurity team. And their role will be to conduct certain tests, and that's fine. So I do think there is a role for someone to do penetration testing, to do a variety of tests, both planned and unplanned, at different stages, and to encourage groups of people who think about accessing your data differently to the way you might, because I don't think anyone really at Optus would expected where this breach was going to occur. At the same time, I have worked in organisations where they have called the police on an ethical hacker, a very large institution in Melbourne, And the ethical hacker said, well, but I'm just, doing a public service. I'm trying to see if you can be breached. And they said, well, no, you don't work for us. So we're calling the police on you. So my interest in this is to make sure that the responsibility for cybersecurity is not the responsibility of the cybersecurity team. It's actually information management, the way that DevOps runs, and having worked in a 27001 environment, but not in the cyber team, but in the DevOps team. There are rules to follow. There's ways of behaviour. There's go no go activities, and it's quite easy. I wouldn't say it's regimented. It's protected. As long as you do this, it's highly unlikely anything's going to happen. So, not just the hacking piece, but also the professional practice in an organisation to ensure that you're doing the best to protect the data that you're managing on behalf of the customers.
I'm keen to hear from Tom. Tom Cleary over in Western Australia. Can you kick in on this? What do you think in terms of ethical hacking and the need for greater professionalism in cybersecurity?
I think there's a great need for professionalism in cybersecurity purely because we have to distinguish between legitimate use of information and illegitimate use of information. Certainly from a law enforcement perspective, they aren't going to be losing data purely because the records management system says after 7 years thou shalt delete it. Part of that is because people tend to lie, which is why we keep track of aliases as well as actual biometrics, because we have had situations where the twin has gone to prison or somebody's transplanted their fingerprints, or lots of examples where people do extraordinary things to try and gain the benefit of unwarranted trust. Now, how we can do that and still have Optus sitting on their little pile of poo and 20 years after the anniversary of the loft, giving evidence to Congress that the next time a major organisation was compromised, bad things would happen and the market would rectify itself. Clearly, that's not the case. And it's not the case over here where legislation says in WA you can't change your driver's licence, whereas in Victoria you can under some circumstances, and in New South Wales it's different in other circumstances. For there to be a fix, there has to be some honest broker who can be trusted to test your systems so that obvious holes like this don't get exploited by the bad guys.
Jay D'Alessandro, do you believe in honesty? Do you believe in professionalism?
Yeah, I believe this is going to get worse before it gets better. I really do. And here's why I say that. So, years and years I've been doing work in this space, and I did an engagement recently with some folks, and from a very recognizable, reputable firm, and they actually made a change to production Active Directory. And I thought, how could you think that this is an appropriate course of action through this type of penetration testing work? No knowledge, no questioning, no, hey, we're going to do this, we're going to give it a try. They just did it. And, CREST is out there. There are other bodies out there giving methodologies, clear professional guidelines for how to conduct penetration testing. I think, again, this could be another one of those places where licensing regulation could actually aid the industry. Having to adhere to a methodology, having to adhere to professional standards, having to have appropriate professional qualifications, those all would serve us with increased professionalism. And I think, honesty might be an underlying characteristic, but the professionalism is, sometimes you need to be guided towards the professionalism.
And Louis, can I ask you, cyber skills, are they used equally? I mean, it comes back to this whole topic question about whether we're winning, but are they equally used for good and evil? What do you think?
Let me rephrase the question outside of cyber and see what people think about it. Would you let somebody try to break into your house just to show that your doors and windows are secure and said, hey, I'm trying to give you a service and tell you how insecure your door is? Where definitely everybody have a strong opinion about it, and the data that you hold in your digital fortress is the same as your house. So absolutely the skills, and that's where I want to differentiate between the ethical hacking, where you are authorized by the business to test their system. Hey, I'm authorized. I want you to test my system to see how robust they are. Or, hey, I want to play and see if I can penetrate Telstra or Optus and see if I can get some data. I'm doing a good service here because I'm health and keep secure. This does not equal that. And the first one is ethical hacking, if he has a professionalism and honesty. Second one is definitely not.
Okay, we're going to switch over now to our car park. And with the car park, this is where we put comments who've been raised online. We're going to have a look right now and see if we've got any particular questions that we think are worth talking about. We'll wait for the screen to load up and we'll just see if there's anything in place. So we've got here Mark. Mark has noted it's just come out today that there was Medicare data in the Optus incident too. Is that okay? And from Susan, how do we change the expectations that people have of places that they purchase goods and services through? Joe, what are your thoughts?
Pick your battle. Pick your battle.
Yeah, which Joe? So many Joes. Yeah, I think, it's interesting. I think the Medicare data there are probably 1,000 different ways that Optus could have created a method with which to store the 100-point identification without including the bare raw data they use to compile the 100 points. It's a hindsight comment for sure, but that's the kind of thinking management should have been doing ahead of time, right? Management shouldn't be thinking reactively. They should be thinking, proactively or prospectively even. I think Susan's comment is broader. How do we change the expectations that people have of places that they purchase goods and services through? Will the marketplace ever come to bear on an organization like Optus where customers leave because their data is insecure? I think is another way to phrase that question. If I were an Optus customer, I'd leave Optus, but I'm not an Optus customer. I think it's probably a broader question, not just for this, but for other things as well. Will those Hawks supporters give back their Hawks memberships, for instance, right? I think there are many other places you could comment. I'd be interested to hear, Joe, what your comment is.
Thanks. I'm interested in the fact it's about the reporting. So the OAIC, the Information Commissioner, has said that in an event of a data breach, you're supposed to report it promptly and report it promptly to them. And so one of the reasons why this is such a problem is that it appears that Optus failed to report it. That's really the issue there. So it's not okay. In terms of Susan's note, really good one, and it comes to what you're saying. I think it's happened already in Europe with the GPDR that if people take responsibility or feel that they have the right to go and make that sort of inquiry, why do you need this from me, and are you going to store it? Certainly, this did come out in for the good old 100-point check where you'd get a printout of something with a QR code. You'd take it down to the post office. You'd identify yourself to the person at the post office. They'd scan in the QR code, and you are then authenticated. And the information is not stored. When eBay started to collect passports and driver's licenses and IDs, there was a huge piece around that. And a lot of people then said they're not going to use eBay anymore.
I just want to ask a question came to my mind here about the Optus breach, since we all keep coming back to that part, is how many people inside Optus have access to that data and they have seen that data, took that data, save it on their computer with the best intent. And then how many people externally get access to those APIs that were able to extract that data before that particular one have had? I can take a bet that this is not something that just happened yesterday and the day after that somebody was able to get that. It has been sitting there for ages.
I think there are two. So I think the two things that were most disturbing to me in some of the press I've read, one was it was a sophisticated attack. None of us believed that it was a sophisticated attack. That was the first thing. The second thing was where the CEO said they couldn't comment further because it's an ongoing investigation. And that is an absolute handball that shouldn't be allowed to be acceptable in the marketplace.
Because you call the police, and then as soon as you said call police, oh, well, it's ongoing investigation, therefore I can't get you any data.
It's been the excuse in the US for years, right, of why companies haven't disclosed breaches, because it's an ongoing investigation.
Another follow-up question, if I may, is off the back of what Mark was saying on his post, why are they storing Medicare? Well, the government requires them to store that information. So I think, Joe, as you were saying, why haven't we got government gateways? Why is government regulation forcing them to hold the data? When the government should be, you take the data, you give it to the government, they track what was done, they give you back a token to talk about the transaction, and that's all you need to store. And it means nothing if it's leaked. So where's the government's responsibility in this regulation to say, we need to take on the verification? Because Medicare and driver's license are both government-based IDs.
Right.
They should be the one verifying them. Thoughts on the regulations around that? Do you think we're going to see any sort of revamping around that, or are we stuck with the government's not wanting to take responsibility?
I think if the government decided to charge for it as a service and made companies adhere to it, I don't see why they wouldn't do it, right? It would be like a subscription service I could, as any large organization or a small organization, sign up for and have, perfect clarity around the robustness of the data behind the verification.
It'd certainly be a lot easier to turn around and say, right, storing Medicare and driver's license is now illegal. You have so many years to get your systems off it, and after that, you can only hold tokens.
That's right.
But PCI have done it many years now.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And if you think
Tokenized
about the
credit card
value of your credit card versus the value of your personal record that you cannot replace, credit card sold today in the black market or dark web around $7 a card. Your personal record is irreplaceable.
Right.
And that one is tokenized. This one, I don't see this is happening for many, many years to come.
I just want to pick up, there was another question in the car park that I'll just briefly touch on, and I'm going to put this to Tom. Tom, one of the questions that was raised online was this idea about personal indemnity. What do you think about personal indemnity or punishment for directors of companies who fail in their duty of care? Are we doing enough? Clearly, it would appear that people are prepared to take these chances.
Yeah, very good question. I think the basics of the problem are that directors are there supposedly to take risks. The opportunity cost of not holding people's data for longer than you need to it is brought on by the fact that you're competing against somebody else who is holding that data. So instead of being able to just run a report and find out what the latest profile for your customer base looks like, you would have to depend on somebody else. Now, the theory would be that government should do that for you and hold the actual source data, but provide, provide views of it to compliant parties. And that's what they're trying to do with things like MyGov and the document verification service. But those are relatively recent initiatives, and the track record isn't particularly great, partly because people don't trust government to do IT properly, probably with good reason.
Yeah, I don't think we have to look any further than BEAR, right? APRA's banking executive accountability regime, right? I mean, even an auditor can have their variable compensation clawed back as a penalty from the regulator for not appropriately doing their job. I mean, that's real teeth in legislation. So why isn't there a telco version of BEAR?
I agree, because I think the banks have got it sort of sorted. It's just these ancillary groups that have suddenly got a document identity or identity verification impost for whatever reason. What do you think?
Yeah, but I also want to generalize your statement that not all the bank fall under APRA, unless you are lending money and you do have that risk profile, then you fall under APRA. If you're not lending money, then I do know a lot of those startups and neobanks that they don't lend you money, they don't fall under APRA. Therefore, that even that they don't have to apply that one.
Right. But I think the underlying issue to Optus is it's a national security issue. And it isn't being treated as a national security issue.
No.
Being treated like an Optus issue.
So
imagine if one of those records, imagine that some of those records belong to people from the military and defense forces. And if there's any of those malicious nations says, I know where this person lives and I know all these details about it. Okay, that's good.
Okay, all right, let's switch to another question now. We've got a question who's coming from the audience, and I'm going to ask, do the same to you. You got a question for us?
Yes, I have a question. The sophistication of cyber attacks has increased greatly in recent years due to malware as a service and ransomware as a service, which make use of the bottlenecks and tools to conduct cyber attacks. What are your strategy and guidelines to prevent cyber attacks related to malware as a service and ransomware as a service?
Okay, Joe.
Yeah, I think there is no way to prevent the attack. I think the preparation and the controls one puts in place to either control, contain, or mitigate the attack is the important aspect. There is no prevention. And I don't think we should be sort of kidding ourselves about it. Ransomware as a service, I'm less worried about than malware as a service, because malware as a service seems to have a lot of development and evolution behind it. And I think that will continue to be a profitable area for malicious actors for quite some time. And I think because it's a profitable area for malicious actors, it'll continue to get some good development. I think there's, maybe I'll say some basic things and some maybe one controversial thing. I think on the basic side, I've read a lot of statistics about malware and ransomware payments. The median payment is around $73,000. And that doesn't sound like a large figure. The frightening part of that figure is it's the median payment, which means it's paid the most number of times, which means small cap to mid cap SMBs, small businesses, are the bigger victims of the crime. And that means that they have a greater susceptibility. I think I'm not going to say anything really earth-shattering here. The basics, you have to know what your assets are, and you have to know what your user access base is. You have to get the basics right. If you get the basics right, then you don't necessarily have to be worried about this area as much. I work with a small company. They're 50 people, and they've just spent about $10,000. And for that, they've got endpoint data protection, right? So they have EDR, which deals with patching and DNS records and user behavior analysis and all the things that potentially could present a risk from this space. They bought some training for their staff that includes phishing software, so they can phish their staff and train their staff how not to click links. They bought a second tier vulnerability analysis suite, which just runs on their publicly facing sites and lets them know what the potential CVEs or what potential records are out there for common exploits. So, I think get the basics right. You don't have to worry in this area. The controversial thing I'll say is, if you're an IT director of a company of any size and you've had a large outbreak of malware or ransomware, your company can't recover, company can't do business, your company can't restore data, you should be fired. You are a moron and you should be fired. And I'm an opinionated guy, but if you haven't been thinking about this as the head of IT, you just shouldn't be in that job.
I'm interested in the way that now, and I think I learned this from at a previous ACS activity event, where the attacks tend to be at the top of the business because most of the usual employees, and particularly the cyber and the IT people, they're all making sure their systems are right, they're not clicking on the links, they take all the training, and the further you go up the business, the less likely they are to have attended the training, to have applied the patch, to have restarted their machine.
Right.
And to be storing material appropriately. So the attacks tend to be very opportunistic, but aimed at the top. I can forward it to Tom. Tom,
you got any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that the points that have been made are all very relevant to today's context. I think the idea that malware is going to grow is a very strong theme. The idea that people are going to become inured to it is backed up by the fact that businesses have got so many ways of avoiding responsibility purely because they can say, oh, it's not my field, we were covered by this framework. But for Optus, I think the fact that they're a telecommunications company and thus governed by Commonwealth legislation, and also because they have a great deal of trust for providing stuff to the hidden side of the universe. Um, they should be maybe hung out to dry for allowing a zero authentication API to be available to the internet. Um, you know, pen testing should have found something like that years ago. If they've got records going back to 2017, then the excuse that we have to keep it for legislative purposes is blown out of the water.
Just something I want to raise that I should have raised at the beginning. One of the things that we're doing tonight is we're running a poll on future topics. So going beyond what we're talking about tonight, we're also going to be running a poll during the night. So one of the things you can do too, whether you're at home, online, is you can go to menti.com. That's menti.com, menti.com. And you can use a code there and enter your vote on a range of different topics to see what you want to participate in. There's a code number, I'll just say it out for you. It's 3529-8675. I'll repeat that. So this is menti.com and the code is 3529-8675 and you can enter your vote in that.
Is it in the chat? We could probably put it
Yep.
in the chat.
Yeah. All right. And you can already see that there's people who are putting their votes in
there's only one
for that. Okay.
I think probably a reflective benefit of the Optus breach is going to be that they weren't more victimized by a sophisticated malicious actor, because a sophisticated malicious actor would have got in there, created a toehold, and they'd be in there for 10 years.
Yeah.
You'd have another Nortel on your hands, right?
Yeah.
I think they were lucky, which is why we know it wasn't a sophisticated attack.
I took the fact that it was only $1 million ransom. I think somebody said it was $1
Crazy.
million. Very opportunistic, I think.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, absolutely. But one thing I just remember to comment on your points, one thing missing from those basic hygienic is monitoring as well.
Mm.
You do the patching, you do all the basic hygienic, but you need to have an eyes on the screen to know, is somebody doing something to try to attack me, or is my staff doing the right things while they're working on my data? Because I need to empower people internal to their work and give them access. So I need to have those both in place. For organization, small organization, I understand that could become a challenge, but when we talk about Optus with millions and millions of dollars of budget, I think it would be silly to say we don't have monitoring in place. We haven't seen that this has happened. That should be picked up the day it has been made available by the monitoring tools. Somebody flagged me and says, there's insecure portal has been made available. Please block it today.
Okay, I've got another question from one of our online guests. Tony Laverton from Central New South Wales says, how is AI changing the way companies make decisions when it comes to cyber prevention and mitigation? And are there ethical considerations with the use of AI in cybersecurity? Tom Cleary, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think a lot depends on whether we're distinguishing between machine learning, narrow AI, or general AI. The theory would be that you let loose your AI, it spots patterns and starts flagging stuff. My experience with some of the major cloud providers and also major product vendors has been that their AIs are a little bit limited. For instance, if you use Azure, it alerts on stuff, but it doesn't really tell you whether it's a risk to your organization or not. Now, I think that's because the machine learning and AI techniques that are used are narrow, so they're focused on particular attacks and will be flagging stuff where you should be worried about it, but that doesn't mean to say it's an actual threat. Now, if we use generalized AI and started replacing people with voiceless things that can point out you should be worrying about things, you end up with scenarios like the current one where people are still trying to understand how bacterial infections are a problem because the pharmaceutical companies are so way behind the AI they can't figure out what it means. Now, training an AI is probably an interesting thing, so long as you know what you're looking for. And our problem is that with cyber and amongst other issues that humanity is facing, we don't really know what we're looking for. So the remainder is for us to use people to do the same thing, because actually having your AI have to train up on a Bayesian filter to spot the phishing attempts, when a human can pick up the very first one, is probably the advantage that people need.
What do you think about that?
I want to differentiate between the AI used in detection and protection mechanism and the AI used to authenticate us as individual to try to get away from the password. First one, regardless of how good or ineffective or effective it is, I'm fine with it. The second one, I think I have some opinion about it. That's, well, I am trusting my Microsoft with my facial data or my fingerprint or all my biometrics or any other vendor from that regards. I need to ensure that those data are handled correctly to go and detect that this is Luay, who is Luay is.
If I can, yeah.
Yes, Joe.
I think the great benefit of AI is that it can use past data to predict a similar event. And I kind of agree with Tom. I think we need to be further ahead of the curve. We're using old data. Those ones are known. We know about those threats. We've got to move ahead. Plus, and I also, Tom, I think that smart people are better able to identify the gaps in secure environments, so-called secure environments, than an AI. But I agree also that the ability of AI to detect if my identity has been compromised because I've been impersonated on the other side of the earth, yes, I'd like that very much, please. Joe?
Yeah, I think all great points. I might gear shift a little bit and say that I think there's more we could do up front in terms of controls that we could put in place. I think when I think about companies broadly adopting AI, I think more, I immediately gravitate towards robotic process automation and using ML and other aspects of that particular domain to replace humans with a better finished outcome. And I think that's one of the places where we can learn from our early forays into the machine learning space by saying, what kind of controls do we need up front? What kind of controls do we need on the back end? Do we need better controls for APIs? Do we need better mechanisms with which our auditors or our level 2 risk can do testing on this? So I do think the points around using AI for monitoring are interesting, and I think we'll see a lot more vendor-initiated thought leadership about that in the near future. But I think on the other side, again, if we get the basics right around controls, we should be setting ourselves up for success there.
Okay, let's jump into the car park. I think we've got some questions in the audience, and we'll go to the audience.
I had a question in my head. Been there for quite a while. I've had the microphone for quite a while, so the conversation's moved on a bit. I don't think I ever heard anything about the legislative basis of landed office to make if they had to have this state for a certain number of years. Now, I had a recent experience where I had to identify myself for a bank. I had to produce 100 points of ID. That 100 points of ID never let myself verify me. Was photocopy or anything like that. I had to then sign a document with the specimen signature while I watched. I put that away. I put my ID back, and they never got a hold on it, never got a copy of it. Why would a telco say that they had such a requirement when they didn't? And why are they getting away with it?
Yeah, I was talking about this same subject, that this is the problem, and we talk.
Actually, I'm not sure we picked up all of that because maybe the microphone is a bit low. Can you just restate the problem?
Is, if I understand the question correctly,
question.
yes, of why Optus or other companies need to maintain a copy of your private data to maintain your identity verification And where is the legislative framework to stop them from doing that? Is that your question?
Yeah, I didn't have the microphone switched on before. Um, Yeah, I was drawing the comparison with the experience I had with a bank where I had to produce my 100 points of ID. I brought that ID with me. They cited it. It never left my sight. They didn't get a copy of it or anything. Went back in my pocket. They knew who I was, that identified me. They got me to give them a specimen signature while they watched, and that was that. They had me identified. They had my specimen signature. They had no copy of any of my ID. They didn't even have the numbers or anything like that taken down off the ID. Why would a telco claim that the government requires them by legislation to get such information and to hold it for many years?
Thanks,
It
Graham.
makes no sense.
Thanks, Graham. Over to the panel.
I totally agree with you. There's absolutely no business for the telco or anybody else to hold your data beyond its intended purposes. But I can make a bet that your experience with the bank is not something I can unify across the banks. I can tell you that every time I go and apply for mortgage or refinance my mortgage, they ask me everything up again, everything is sent to them, emails or PDF documents, and there is no way I can set assured that they have destroyed that data beyond that intended purposes. So yeah, there's no national framework or anything that's stopping businesses from maintaining your identity beyond the intended purpose, which is identify yourself. That should be instantly. Did I identify you? Okay, good. The data is gone. I can continue with your verified process and move on.
Let's jump into the car park. We've got some other questions that have just come through. Mark asks, is there a need for tighter restrictions on information sharing? Joe D'Alessandro.
You know, I think probably the simple, straightforward answer is yes. But you know, is the data being used for its intended purposes, right? Because you know, I would need to acknowledge the potential sharing of my data to the source with whom I'm sharing my data prior to my data being shared. So, you know, I think, should there be tighter restrictions on that? Maybe there should just be increased penalties on that. And maybe those penalties should be tied into the appropriate use and security of data.
I've worked in areas where we're sharing health information, and sharing health information across Australia is actually quite difficult because it's in Victoria. You have no Victorian has implicitly given the right for their data to be shared, whereas elsewhere in Australia they have. And it's implicit that if you're in hospital and you've provided information to a hospital, another state could pick up that data for its intended purpose. But if you're from Victoria, they can't get it. You have to go back to the place that collected the data and say that you'd like it shared. So there are I'm in favour of sharing data safely, because I think the more we're able to share, particularly health information, combine health information from different sources, the better off we are. And in the education sector in Victoria, there is a goal of sharing data from different sources in order to ensure the safety and security of the child. So it might be police information needs to be communicated quickly into a school should the family circumstances change. So there's good reasons for sharing it, but it must be shared safely.
I have a different opinion here, and I just want to have a controversial opinion here. While I totally agree and concerned about the Optus breach and all the information in the PII data that the businesses have, but on the same token, we go and be so vocal about these kind of incidents, but then we hand over our data to the social media, the Facebook, the LinkedIn, the Instagram, all the things about your date of birth, where have you been, what your interest and everything. We're happy to share that data. We have to go and hand over all those personal information that as dangerous, if it's not more dangerous than the PII data that Optus or Telstra or the banks have on us. So yes, we do need the data restriction, but also we need to have a better judgment into the risks of hand over that data, whatever that might be, to those businesses.
So I think the government has a role then to make sure that that the risk is then managed appropriately. And in some ways I compare this to we all expect to be able to get a mortgage, and the risk around our ability to repay that mortgage is managed with government controls. But if you go back, 100 years, no one was borrowing 95% of the value of a house. No one would have gotten it, and it would have been an extreme risk that people probably identified at the time. So our appetite for that risk and our expectation that those risks will be managed on our behalf might be part of the issue.
One of the other questions that comes from Susan: does this week highlight the need to shift the perception that cybersecurity is still about maintaining the fence instead of looking at what's behind it? Tom Cleary, have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, this one goes straight to the heart of the glass wall between development and operations. My own view is that if we're working in ICT, we should at least be within shouting distance of competence across all of these skill sets. I'm a particularly poor programmer, but I can program, and I do understand what the constraints of working within a project team, particularly in a CI/CD kind of environment, are. But for people whose role is to do architecture or business analysis, to speak only in terms of finance, leads to the situation I've had myself where people kind of go, stop speaking dolphin at me, purely because, has anybody ever tried to explain a subnet to a CEO? It doesn't work because he wants a number. Give me a number. If the number is higher than the other number, I'm either going to say yes or no, depending. Sorry, that's the wrong answer. You should actually understand what the context of the risk of your organization is, because everybody's going online.
Yeah, Joe.
I think that's a great point, but I think it isn't necessarily the CEO's. I don't know that it's the CEO's need to know that as much as it is to have the appropriate risk advisors and the appropriate technology advisors who can articulate in a specific dollar and cents way what the risk to the organization is, right? It goes to Joe's
Can I
earlier
just
point
jump
about
back in on that one?
risk appetite. Yeah.
Yeah, back to you, Tom.
I joined the BCS in 1988, and the headline on my first Computer Weekly was, Britain needs more hybrid IT managers. I can speak finance, but you can't express a subnet in finance terms, because when you say risk, is that opportunity risk, or is it like insurance risk, or is it something I should worry about for audit risk? It's something where the CEO actually has to give us to care about what he's talking about and do something where he's not.
I think you're right, Tom. I think you're right, and I wasn't saying what I was saying because I don't think the CEO should care, but there has to be an appropriate derivation of a value of risk at Optus that takes into the probable frequency and the probable magnitude of a loss expressed as a dollar value. And someone in Optus made the calculation to say, if we lose 10 million records, it's going to cost us X dollars. And the CEO should have been able to contextualize that enough to say, within our spending of N millions of dollars for security and technology controls, where have we compensated for this risk, or where have we accounted for this risk management?
I just want to go back to the car park. We had one other comment that was in a similar vein. Just bring that one up again. So this was from Vinoth, who says, is there any regulation in work to tokenize all PII data instead of storing them as is? Louay.
Not to my knowledge. We were talking about that earlier and said, look, it does make sense to have a body like the payment gateway to hold the data securely and entirely as possible and give you a token and said, this is identity of Louay, but doesn't exist to my knowledge.
No. I don't know of it any other.
No, and yet that was mentioned in one of the news items. It was implied that the data had been encrypted or hashed in some way, and but from the data released, it implies that wasn't true.
Absolutely not. It's encrypted at storage, but not when you run the API call and
Right.
extract that data.
Yeah.
That's
You've got it.
it's straight to you in clear text.
One European system which I worked on required all personally identifiable data to be tokenized. So in actual fact, there was no actual real name or anything like it on the actual system itself. That, by the way, was in the medical and hospital space system. And the personal identifiable information had to be not just encrypted, yes, that's fine, but it was also tokenized, which was rather interesting. Yeah, yeah.
Not on certain millenniums, no.
But more importantly here is we don't know what the EAL level was. No application, no system can be any more secure than the operating system and the hardware on which it runs. The old rule of computing. We don't know, I don't know, what operating system was hosting this database system and how accessible that operating system was. What its EAL level was, what its evaluation level was, what its access control system was. We don't know. All we're hearing about is the database. That doesn't matter. It's a part, it is under controlled by the base operating system. Anybody got any ideas what the OS was, or what the implications were of that, or what they're going to do about it?
Great question. All right, let's go to Sudhira. You've got a question for us.
Yes, thanks, David. I would like to shift the conversation from attack to defense and try to understand how organizations can best protect their data and the organization itself. So going back to frameworks, right? There are a number of different frameworks. I'd like to understand, is one better than the other? And also, are organizations using them purely for the sake of compliance, or should they using the frameworks for the risk management? And finally, like to understand how does the Australian Essential 8 stack up against these principles?
Can I take the last part of his question? Essential 8 is close to my heart because we work on that regularly. And Essential 8 is what it is. It's essential. Just by meeting Essential 8 doesn't mean you are secure. If you want to go and look at the overall secure, ASD has released the top 35 controls that include monitoring, include segmentation, include zero trust strategy. None of that exists in Essential 8. And that's the key problem with Essential 8. It has so much publicity that company's director and CEO says, we comply with Essential 8, we're good. No, you're not. That's the basic hygienic essential. That's the floor, not the ceiling. And that's where many businesses says, tick box Essential 8, that's we're good. So that's where my view on Essential 8. It's great, but it's just a starting point in your security roadmap.
Anybody else got any different?
I'd be interested to hear what your thought is about who is accountable for the maturity behind someone who uses Essential 8. So if I use Essential 8, where is the demand for me to increase my maturity over time? Because I think that's probably the biggest absent part of it, is that someone can point to any framework and say, I adhere to this framework, and therefore I am quote unquote compliant. And compliance, I think, is a bit of a loaded word. There was a great AFR article recently where, I can't remember who it was at Macquarie Bank, said by next year they were to pay $1 billion a year for their compliance. That's a significant, and they weren't saying it because, they weren't saying it for what you would assume naturally would be a complaint, but they were saying it because it's a cost of doing business that they realize they must undertake to ensure that they've got the kind of public trust they need. And I think that's an interesting approach because underneath that there's a level of maturity and self-reflection about your requirements to be accountable for what you steward and how you steward it. Whereas companies I've worked with that have to be essentially compliant or have to be essentially compliant say the same thing that the ones you've encountered have, which is, well, we're essentially compliant. I worked with a company recently that said, but we're ISO 27001 compliant. And I said, that's great. It's a management standard, not a control standard. Where's your evidence of controls effectiveness? Well, we don't have evidence of controls effectiveness.
Because they're quoting an amount of money they're spending, as if that proves they've spent it effectively.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think the test of effectiveness is the test that they have to live up to. And I think there is in their industry a requirement for a test of effectiveness, right? APRA CPS 234 demands a test of effectiveness. And if you've ever gone through a tripartite audit with APRA, you'll know that they get on the hip waders and the long gloves and they go deep in terms of figuring out if your controls are effective or not, as it should be. So I do agree with you, right? There has to be some context around it. But the fact of the matter is, if you've got an approach towards accountability of your business around your stewardship of data and data protection, well, then the accountability should line up.
It's just like Y2K revisited, where how much money you spent was proof that you'd done your job. The only difference is this one is unceasing. It hasn't got an end date.
But that's cybersecurity in general. It's an infinite game, not a zero-sum game, right? Your only way to play it is to ensure that you mitigate, reduce, or remove your potential from being a victim, right? That's the only way you play an infinite game.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm going to change to one last quick question. Joe Delvine, listen up, for this is for you. How do we secure data? Statistics show the significant
Solve that
increase
for
in
us,
data
would you?
procedures are based on stolen login credentials. Passwords are a core problem. Do we need a different view of authentication? Joe Delvine.
Oh, thank you so much for such an
And
easy
I'll
one
pass
to
around to
finish
the
on.
others
I
as
think
well.
I'll be passing
You're
around to the
first.
others. Look, I was going to actually answer part of your question and say that part of the defence is actually to not have the data in the first place. So I think the larger organisations that are that have compliance imposed on them and need to spend the money, they're okay. But those of us that are working in smaller organisations that are overseeing databases, making decisions about what to capture and for how long to capture, we can make the most difference. Particularly, I mean, I've so many databases I've inherited where I said, could you throw out the date of birth? We don't need the date of birth. And they said, well, we'd like it for to make sure we've got the right, John Smith. And go, no, we'll have to think of another way because we're not using the date of birth, and I can't guarantee this isn't going to escape. So it's actually collecting and only what you need and not keeping what you don't need. So there's been I'm very keen to ensure that happens in any business that I work in. In terms of and that would mean that if obviously a business wants to maintain customer loyalty, well, can they make up a username and a password? Are they required to hand over their anonymity in order to transact with you, which I think is a privacy rule? So that's number one. If you're just sort of deciding to purchase something from Woolworths, do they need to know your actual name, or can they need to know something's on the credit card, but that's about it. They shouldn't need to know anything else about it. But I'm also very interested in some of the newer methods for identifying individuals that don't require username and password, and there's multiple, and I'm going to hand over to the two experts to talk about them, because I'm aware of them and I use them, but I haven't implemented them.
Luay.
I like to acknowledge what Microsoft has been pushing toward the passwordless authentication. While it has still some time to mature, but we are heading to the right direction, that we don't have to have a password, username and password. We can replace it with biometrics, although it has start asking questions about how those biometrics are handled. But it's still, at least Microsoft is trying to push toward, I don't have to make you remember the password while you're on my system, which is a big tick box. It's work in progress, but I like where that's going in that regard, and I would definitely welcome to get rid of the passwords the sooner rather than later.
Tom Cleary, your views on different thoughts about authentication?
For me, that's a bit of a two-edged sword, because on the one hand, the government has to be able to identify you to deliver services. And on the other hand, despite the fact that Essential 8 stops 85% of intrusions, we still end up with reports coming from various auditor groups saying that government can't comply. It's quite a challenge for many organisations to handle information appropriately without the concept of information as property. Because if they're going to lose your personal information, somebody should be accountable for it.
Yep.
And if that's
Joe
government,
D'Alessandro.
Go ahead, Tom.
sorry, I was just going to say, if it's government, then potentially somebody is underwriting the system the appropriate way. Because when you think about it, a company that mishandles your information should be regulated, and it should be the regulator who's accountable for it.
Yeah, I think great points, Tom. You know, I think I probably read about 30 or 35 controls effectiveness reports a year for various companies. Some large, like Amazon and Microsoft and Salesforce, and some smaller companies. Nobody gets user access management right. There are more user access management defects in those controls reports, be they SSA 18 or APRA CPS 234 or ISAE 3402 or whatever they are. And I think getting user access management right is hard. It's really hard. And getting privileged access management right is hard. And it's the fundamental underpinning of a number of different breach problems we have out there. The more we move towards a passwordless approach towards whatever we do, the better off we'll be, because we can't do a good job managing users. And we can't do a good job managing privileged users.
So we've run out of time. I just want to summarize on what we're talking about here. So we've touched on a few things today. We've looked at Optus and the adequacy of our regulatory frameworks. We've looked at the need for greater professionalism in cybersecurity, malware as a service, ransomware as a service, the use of botnets, ethical considerations on AI and security, and whether or not the Essential 8 provides sufficient protection. The question that we were asking tonight was, cybersecurity, are we winning? And what were the key points, the key takeaways? To quote our panel, people lie. And to quote our panel, some members of the C-suite are morons. So we haven't answered anything, but I think what we've shown here is that it's a mixed bag, that there are so many different varietal elements to what we're talking about here. There is a no one-size-fits-all solution to any of these things. And that's why we're addressing them here in the ACS Think Tank. So to continue that conversation, we want you to be a part of this and to take it further. I'm sure there's things that we could have touched on and taken further. There's an opportunity for you to do that after this. Look out for our write-up on tonight's event. You'll be able to see that in Information Age, and you can leave your additional comments. Please keep this conversation going. I'd like to thank tonight's panellists, so please put our hands together for Joe Dalveen, Louay Gashash, Joe D'Alessandro, and from Western Australia, Tom Cleary. Thank you for sharing your perspectives. Thank you for a great audience. Some fantastic questions have come through tonight. And now it's probably that time when we might check out on what our member survey is looking like for future topics. So this is where we're looking at possibilities, and it looks to me like the voting is saying that facial recognition, identity management versus dystopian nightmare seems to be winning, only just over how much automation is IT, is it too much, and where do we draw the line on jobs for humans. So we'll come back to you on that. We'll look for future ones in the past. The next think tank, we decided this last time, the next think tank is on the 17th of November, and that will be in Adelaide, and where we'll be tackling the topic of addressing gender diversity, inclusion in technology, and where does merit sit. So that event will be on the website, and I'd ask you to have a look at that and think about questions in advance. Put your questions, post them early. Let's get the conversation started as soon as well. In the chat, if you have a look, if you're online, if you're on the chat, you'll see a link that'll help you to provide some feedback, and we'd love you to give your thoughts about how you thought about tonight. Did we go deep enough? What are some of the things that we perhaps didn't cover? What are the things we did really well? Let us know how you go. I look forward to seeing you next time when we do things in Adelaide. Thanks for joining us tonight. Stay safe. Thank you to the panel. Thanks to everyone here in person, and thanks to everyone online. Good night.
Thank you.